In the world history, experiments on human beings have been performed almost all the time. Not all the results of such experiments have survived, but the no less inhumane and monstrous experiments of the last century may have overshadowed all that occurred before. Welcome to the channel. Today we are going to talk about experiments on humans throughout our world history. You're watching Flip Side of History. In ancient times, the first experiments were, quite logically, performed by the healers of any given society. In studying the effects of various drugs on the human body, healers used whatever was known at the time, from mercury to arsenic. Obviously, either sick slaves or lawbreakers were used as test subjects. It is true, however, that there were also far from medical experiments that aimed to conduct some kind of research, such as which language was the earliest and the most native in ancient Egypt. Ancient scientists were extremely interested in the search for the natural language of mankind. Over 2,500 years back, an Egyptian pharaoh decided to discover which language was inherent to mankind. For this very purpose, he placed two of his own children in complete isolation. It is not known how long the pharaoh's children lived in isolation, but when the experiment was over and the children were brought back into the throne room, one of them spoke a word similar to bekos, which in Phrygian was a word for bread. On the basis of this experiment, Pharaoh declared that the innate language of mankind was indeed Phrygian. As humankind evolved, there were more and more unexplored questions, so the experiments on humans became just more and more sophisticated and inhumane. In the 15th century, to prove the assumption that Hebrew is the innate language, King James IV sent a deaf woman and her children to an empty island. Well, sometime later, when the victims were visited by the king himself, they spoke to him in the finest Hebrew. It is true that many scientists consider this information to be complete folklore. After all, apart from the king, no one else reported the results of the experiment. But James IV's prior was Emperor Friedrich II, and he generally believed that newborn children were blessed by nature itself with powers that would allow them to survive on their own. For proof of this belief, he collected newborn children who were even fed without touching them, let alone taking them in someone's arms. Eventually, the experiment ended tragically. All the babies died from complete abandonment. Other of Friedrich's experiments were attempts to discover the spirit or soul of a human being. For this purpose, one or two criminals were placed in a barrel, and the barrel was sealed tightly, leaving only a small hole. Through this hole, supposedly the souls of the dead had to come out. At least that's what the king believed. However, we cannot say anything about the success of this gruesome experiment since the history does not tell us. Evidently, apart from the deaths of the unfortunates, there were no other results. Finally, to see who was digesting the food faster, Friedrich ordered two prisoners to be fed a full meal. After supper, the first was put to bed and the second was sent out to hunt. In the morning, to see who digested the food faster, both of the poor men had their bellies cut open. As humanity developed even further, the level of insanity of the experiments conducted on people escalated. For example, in the commonly referred to as enlightened 18th century, the French physicist Jean-Antoine Nollet decided to check the speed with which electric current spreads. For this exact purpose, he took several dozen monks as experimental material. Having lined them up in a chain 1 kilometer long, the physicist forced the monks to join hands, and then commanded those standing at the end of the chain to touch the bare wires. Understandably, almost instantly, the entire chain jumped up, screaming in pain. Based on this experiment, Jean-Antoine Nollet concluded that the speed of current distribution was very high. By the way, the famous fiction of Frankenstein is not a fiction. This story was based on the very real events. The German alchemist-scientist Konrad Depp used to steal the bodies of the recently dead from cemeteries and try to resurrect them. His, let's say, colleague in his hobby, the Italian doctor Luigi Galvani, also stole or bought back the bodies of the dead and then experimented with the effects of electricity on dead bodies. He may also have tried to bring them back to life. In reality, though, the bodies that were electrocuted were simply twitched limbs and nothing more. His nephew, Giovanni Aldini, took advantage of his uncle's results by arranging a real tour of Europe, where he demonstrated experiments with electricity on bodies. It was Aldini who revived the executed convicted criminal George Frastria by connecting a powerful battery to his limbs. Depending on the voltage applied, the body would move its arms, make facial expressions, and even try to dance. The century that followed was infamous for one of the most gruesome and monstrous experiments done by Henry Heyman. The scientists believed that using rats and mice for experiments did not produce the necessary results. So in order to prove the hypothesis of whether a child could contract gonorrhea, he took two mentally ill children and, for the purity of the experiment, a young man dying of an incurable disease. Children and a man were injected with the gonorrhea virus, and over time the disease developed, exhibiting all the symptoms. The scientist rejoiced. His hypothesis was brilliantly confirmed, although at that time there was no treatment for gonorrhea, and we can only guess about the fate of the unfortunate children infected with the incurable disease. At roughly the same time, Marion Sims, a rather famous physician and scientist, was searching for methods of treating female obstetric fistula. But the development of the methods themselves was, to put it mildly, inhumane. The scientist directed slave women suffering from this illness to lie down on the operating table without telling them the purpose of the operation. The poor patients did not receive any anesthesia, so we can only guess how they suffered. Of course, the results helped to find ways of treatment, but the methods themselves were disapproved by the scientific community. Let's move to the 20th century. The 20th century, which was expected to be the beginning of humanism and a radical change of attitudes toward human beings, was, in fact, a living hell for people. And it was not so much about horrendous and bloody wars as it was about the fact that the individual had become a common testing material for a variety of sometimes extremely hideous experiments. True, it must be said that many scientists have experimented on themselves. For example, the Romanian expert physician Nicolae Minovici, in order to fully understand the process of asphyxiation, personally made several attempts to hang himself. He hung for the longest time in a loop for 26 seconds. It is true that later, in 1941, Minovici suffered the consequences of these experiments and eventually died. Another such scientist was Professor Alan Blair, who proved that the bite of the black widow spider was poisonous. To convince his colleagues, he purposely pressed the poisonous spider against him, and then the scientist was pumped out in the hospital for quite a long time. Finally, third on the list was Stubbins Firth, who examined malaria. He proved that the urine and vomit of a sick person did not contain the pathogen, for which purpose he specifically drank both the urine and the vomit of those who had fallen ill. Later, it turned out that his hypothesis was incorrect, because he took the remedy from those in whom the disease had progressed to a late stage, which was not contagious. But others in the scientific world were not so picky. For example, Cornelius Rhodes, having received funding for experiments on the effects of cancer cells, infected several residents in Puerto Rico in 1931. Soon many of the subjects died, but the doctor himself did not regret what he had done. All of the doctors derived pleasure from the anguish of the victims of failed experiments. In town of Tuskegee, Alabama, started a gruesome syphilis research experiment in the early 40s. In exchange for free medical care and treatment, some 400 impoverished farmers agreed to be infected with syphilis. But in 1947, the wildest thing was that the discovered penicillin had already proven its ability to fight this horrible disease. But the farmers were not concerned at all. They continued to be monitored. The experiment ended only in 1972. Many dozens of test subjects died, having previously infected their both wives and children. By the way, the world-renowned psychologist and psychiatrist Loretta Bender, author of the Bender Gestalt test, apart from her immense contributions to psychology, characteristics of nonverbal intelligence, perceptual motor coordination, was also into some rather sinister things. In search of a cure for childhood schizophrenia, she treated about 100 sick children with hallucinogenic mushrooms. If a child got worse, the results were and are not officially known, except for the allegation that the so-called treatment was apparently successful. And lastly, the infamous Japanese Unit 731 experiments that eclipsed anything humanity had previously known about savagery. Japanese pseudo-scientists, after the occupation of China, were engaged in the development of new types of bacteriological weapons, which were tested on prisoners. On purpose, Chinese people had their legs and arms cut off, gangrene provoked, entire areas infected with plague fleas, living people vivisected, and other cruelest surgeries performed on them. One of the most inhumane experiments was to stick a prisoner's head in a pressure cooker and turn it on. Then the so-called back-then scientists would test how long after turning it on, the hapless person's eyes would pop out. And it seemed that the end of the World War II would put an end to these horrific experiments. But after the war, the situation has not changed one little bit. This and the spraying of powder over San Francisco with the bacteria that caused the outbreak of pneumonia. And in 1955, the spraying of the pertussis bacteria in Tampa Bay, and the yellow fever-infected mosquitoes released in 1956 in Florida and Georgia in the US. Either civilization or the triumph of humanism does not seem to affect the continued need for human beings to carry out experiments, and particularly for military reasons. Innocent and often unsuspecting human beings who just live and breathe on Earth often are turned into victims. Thank you for watching this episode. Leave a like, subscribe, and as always, expect more episodes on our channel. Besides, watch our other videos.